Welcome to Bundle Place Gallery and to Art Bites, our monthly series of art talks. To begin, let's acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we're gathered today, the Bunurong, Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Joining us today is Professor of Art History, Rex Butler. Rex Butler has written about Australian art and artists since the late 1980s. He has written and edited several books on Australian art and is involved in the online Melbourne Art Review website, Memo Review. He is Professor of Art History at the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at Monash University. Please welcome Rex.
Thanks, everyone. Yes, there's a bit of pressure on me today because my children told me not to screw it up. They remember Miffy very fondly from their youth, and we came around here about a month ago, and they loved it, and it sort of brought lots back to them. So I hope I don't. In fact, I was driving my daughter to school for her last year this year, and she had a great discussion about Dick Bruna's use of colour, which is going to be very helpful to me today, I think. So, but what I'll do is I won't talk directly about Miffy in a way. What I'm going to talk about are some of his, I guess, acknowledged sources. So this is going to be a little bit like us all going to school with Miffy, I think. But it's interesting that Dick Bruna talks about the influence of the Bauhaus Stijl, which is perhaps obvious because he's Dutch, and constructivism, and indeed Matisse, which has sort of made me try and put my mind to a little bit. God, what are the connections between Miffy and Matisse? And we'll have a go at that. But it's kind of, I think, interesting to look at the sources of his work, because what's obviously evident about Dick Bruna's work is this incredible abstraction. It's like abstract art. There's no children's design, children's book illustrator that makes work as pared down and reductive as this. And so, that's where he's coming from. And the colours of his work make the work. They always correspond to a particular sort of sensitivity or sensibility in the panels. You sort of read the colours first before you read anything. And it's great. I was chatting with Sarah that they've done the gallery using the Miffy colours. I mean, you probably know a little bit about him. He comes from a family of book illustrators, but interestingly, he did Miffy for, I think, a rival book illustration company. He's incredibly prolific. He did lots and lots of covers, but the thing that he became famous for and sort of renowned for and sort of identifiable as is the guy who did Miffy. And actually, having tried to put my mind to this, it's very hard to sort of put your finger on what it is that's great about Miffy. And as I say, there's this incredible abstraction about it, which I think is very puzzling for a children's book. And so I'm going to just offer these kind of little brief histories, I suppose, of the 3 or 4 things that he mentions as his big influence. I hope that's okay. The big question is, how do you go from these big schools or major artistic trends to the work is a complex question. We might put our minds to that at the very end of what I'm going to say today. So one of the things he mentions is very influential upon him is the Bauhaus. Now, some of you probably know about the Bauhaus. It was started in 1919 in Weimar in Germany, post-war Germany, which at the time after the defeat of the war was actually for a moment quite liberal. And so one of the things that they did is they asked this architect called Walter Gropius, who'd served in the war and came from a very famous family of architects and is actually a magnificent architect. That's a building he made before he became the director of the Bauhaus. Actually, this thing that we're in today, this beautiful building, is totally post-Bauhaus. I hope everyone realises that, with its beautiful curves, the open windows. And the thing about this space that we're in is it's transparent to the outside. You can stand outside and see inside the foyer, and then you can see the cantilevered levels of the building, right, up in the library and even here in the main floor. And that kind of visibility is the Bauhaus thing, that the form of the building echoes its function. So you can read what it's used for. There's no kind of ornament. I mean, there is beautiful ornament in this building, but that's a sort of add-on. The principle of Gropius's great architecture is that the form echoes the function. And in this famous, beautiful early building. It's got that transparent facade you can see. I teach at Monash at the campus at Caulfield, which used to be a technical college, and it's on a very busy main road. And it too had a visible facade. It's a bit Art Deco at the time because it's built around them. But again, it's incredibly pared back, unornamental, and sort of emphasises its functionality. And that's the Bauhaus thing. So they got Gropius to start an art school. And what Weimar did is, and very importantly, is they put together their fine art school, classic high art, with their arts and crafts, tech school you might have called it, and put them together. And that's the thing that Gropius started to run. Now, he had a number of incredibly famous people who ended up working there, like Kandinsky and Klein. We'll talk about that. But his first two hires, you might say, were very interesting and strange people. And already, when you see this, Johannes Itters, who had a big influence on the early days of the Bauhaus, although he was a very strange guy, had a very peculiar spiritual beliefs, some kind of Zoroastrian religious belief that came from Persia, and he shaved his head to sort of imitate that and cultivated this kind of cult persona for the students. He's one of the sort of figures through whom one sees the Bauhaus as this kind of, this cult institution, although that is exactly the thing that Bauhaus wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be very instrumentalist and functionalist and, artisanal. But here's the opposite. But he was a famous drawer and colourist, and that's one of his designs. And you can see very early on the pure exploration of colour. You can begin to see the Miffy-esque things. One of the other early lecturers is a guy who Gerhard Mark, and he's an owl. He's a bit more of an old school drawer. But let's look at a couple of the other, Bauhausy things. This is Oskar Schlemmer. This is sort of mid-period Bauhaus. Bauhaus goes from 1919 to 33 when it ended up being closed by the Nazis. We'll talk about its upheavals. It ends up moving from Weimar to Dessau at a certain point where Gropius builds another beautiful building for the Bauhaus. It's a very vexed institution. It never entirely worked. What are some of the tensions of it? The fine arts lecturers, the people who think they're artists, were very upset at being called artisans. On the other hand, the artisans that Gropius, and it's a very utopian sort of project, and the whole notion today of like the fusion of high and low art, the fact that we have Miffy in an art gallery, is inspired and in fact made possible by the Bauhaus. But there are incredible tensions putting together high and low art. And no one could really, and this is the first time anyone tried to do it, and Gropius admittedly made lots of mistakes. The fine arts people were really upset at being called artisans. The kind of skills they tried to teach, the artisanal skills in the first moment of the Bauhaus, were really kind of old school and old fashioned and deliberately artisanal, like bookbinding, which was crazy because at the time already, of course, they were making mechanically reproduced books. So you didn't need bookbinders, that was just silly. Finally, everyone thought that ultimately at the top of the pyramid was Gropius with his architecture. The architecture was the true model for all the other art forms taught. The Bauhaus means building house. And it's a lovely idea that this building is made up of little houses. That's Gropius's idea, but people sort of resented Gropius, and Gropius had a lot of trouble controlling his staff. But he had these prodigiously talented people working for him. Oskar Schlemmer is really quite famous, and one of the other things, the opening up of all the arts and putting them together. So here's a lovely example of theatre and painting coming together. This cross-medium thing is one of the things that the Bauhaus starts, and they're spectacular, presentations and incredibly influential. There was quite a nice Bauhaus exhibition at Buxton's. Did anyone see it for the centenary in 2019 before the COVID lockdown? And the quite interesting, quite important contemporary Australian woman artist, Carla Mccrae, did a performance where a whole bunch of people dressed up and walked, I think, down Collins Street and got filmed. And it's kind of very much inspired by these kind of things. Later in the history of the Bauhaus, a guy called Albers gets involved, Joseph Albers, in the very late days of the Bauhaus. He ends up going to something called the Black Mountain College in America, in Colorado, and inspires people like Robert Rauschenberg into performance art. And again, in America, as you probably know, Rauschenberg's work, again, the collapse of the distinct genres, like Rauschenberg's work, like half sculpture, half painting. So the whole 20th century trajectory of the collapse of distinct art forms starts with this school. Here's another, I think, absolutely lovely Kurt Schmidt Mechanical Ballet Bauhaus. Of course, it has connections with the Russian constructivists who are doing approximately the same thing at the same time. But it's really wonderful kind of work. But here we have some of the big names of the Bauhaus. Paul Klee. Now, he ran, in fact, because these now incredibly famous artists weren't given the jobs as painters or drawers. That had already been taken. Paul Klee ended up running a course in coloured glass construction, for churches and stuff. I mean, and it suits, of course, his beautiful translucent style. And again, I think you can begin to see some of the connections between Paul Klee and Miffy, and that's one of his other beautiful works. And my God, look at that, just turn around, you see the connections right there. And Vasily Kandinsky is arguably the most famous of the Bauhaus instructors. And he's the most haughty of them all. He had this very complex and interesting history. He was born in Russia, leaves Russia under the sort of the oppressive czars. He's living in Germany, but he's very attracted by the Russian Revolution. He goes back in 1917. That doesn't turn out that well for him, of course, when the sort of proletarian arts start to come in, when they start initiating a communist art program. So he goes back to Germany and ends up joining the Bauhaus. And of course, Kandinsky is the great theorist of colour in the 20th century and indeed abstraction. He wrote an incredibly influential book. It's called Concerning the Spiritual and Art, which came out in 1912. It went absolutely around the world and influenced every abstract artist in the 20th century. As Sarah mentioned, I'm quite interested in what happens in Australian art in an offbeat way. It's really fascinating that when Kandinsky's book came out in German, it was reviewed in Australian newspapers quite seriously. People took it up, knowing it was a big thing overseas. It actually proves, I think, despite our prejudices, how cosmopolitan we actually were in the early 20th century. I couldn't imagine a book like that being reviewed in our newspapers today, but that's a really uncanny fact. So that is one of the most influential artist books of the 20th century. And Kandinsky thought he had devised a science of colour, that colours could correspond to particular moods. He could put them together in particular combinations and actually produce these very specific emotions in his audience. And so, this is like a legible object, according to Kandinsky. In his sketchbooks, he puts these together and says, at the end of it, you're going to feel a mild feeling of exaltation with a little tiny bit of depression and ultimately a feel of optimism with the red and stuff, right? And that is exactly, Dick Bruna knew this book very well. Any artist knew it, and like a Bible in a way, especially if you're a colourist. And he does that. Like, he matches the colour to the mood of his pictures, thinking the colour actually can produce that sensation. And that comes from Kandinsky. Now, he had some ups and downs. He fell out. I mean, he didn't take it at all well that he was working with craftspeople and that kind of stuff. But here are some of the students' works from Kandinsky's colour class, showing you how he's kind of passed on his lessons. And as I say, because Kandinsky really felt, he was a scientist of colour, he absolutely instructed his students to sort of imitate them, which is again a very profound new artistic idea. This is not about sort of self-expression or inspiration. This is like technology that he's passing on. So, there are lessons to be learnt with colour that you can just do it, right? And these are some of his students. And, you can see that, to our minds, they're extremely imitative, but for Kandinsky, that's what he wanted. He wanted kind of disciples. He can strike us as a very haughty man, but he truly thought he was like a scientist, showing you the results of his colour experiments. But absolutely, you can see all of these things in the Dick Brunas, for example. Now, about the mid-1920s, there was a big show. I mean, Gropius is a kind of genius, right? And he's trying very hard to sort of think, because he's an architect. I'll show you some nice examples. This is one of the other things, of course, the Bauhaus is very, very famous for, design and furniture. And it's a look that gets endlessly imitated in every kind of hipster design shop in Melbourne, but it's ripping off the Bauhaus in its sort of geometric form and simplicity. And again, the beautiful thing about Bauhaus design, at least in principle, is that the form echoes the function. Like, the light there looks like a light. There's no sort of bullshitting around like hiding the light or any of that. There it is. It just illuminates the thing that is meant to be illuminated, and that's what it does. The teapot is just a teapot, etc., etc. Now, Gropius as an architect, and of course the art school had to kind of pay its way. And it paid its way by actually making stuff that it sold, and it quite successfully, all the way up to the great crash of 29 when, the world went bankrupt, probably a bit like today. They made quite a lot of money manufacturing things, and their designs were used quite widely. And they had a very big show, a very famous and important show called Art and Technology, which again is the sort of, first putting on the table of the idea that art and technology can work together. In 1923, that Gropius was behind. It was a complete failure. Everyone got very snobby and snooky about it, and a lot of the lecturers, who were involved, got very disillusioned by that. And and Gropius himself started to wonder if he was really the man for the job, which is kind of interesting. And so they brought in, they sacked Eiton, who was a kind of cult spiritualist, and one of the new dominant lecturers is a guy called Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who's one of the world's 20th century's major artists. And, he's an artist who completely puts into his practice new technologies. He, of course, is Kandinsky-esque in some ways, but really what Moholy-Nagy is very famous for is his new form of abstract photography. He's one of the great photographers of the 20th century, photography as kind of abstraction. And he taught these technologically based courses, design and photography. And I should have shown you some of Moholy-Nagy's famous poster designs. And, because the simplicity of the Brunas are absolutely imitative of many of the things the graphicness of some of the Bauhaus designs. And I thought, I thought one of the really nice responses in the show, one of the more faithful ones, if I could say that, I'm not trying to be mean to everyone else, is this one by Carla Mccrae, where, I think in her taking up in the Miffy style a whole variety of technological objects, it's just next door, I think she gets completely the Bauhaus idea that, fine arts or the arts in general are absolutely involved in the making of everyday objects, and she sort of does in Miffy colours a typewriter or a computer screen, all that kind of stuff. That's really, I think, quite clever. But the tension was building, and after that disastrous 23 show, the Weimar government, Republic, wasn't that happy with the Bauhaus. There's too many weird things going on, so they sort of threw them out. And they went to a new location in Dessau, more north in Germany, where Gropius built the famous, iconic piece of Bauhaus architecture. You can see it, the new school there, which is the design of like every university, every technical facility in Australia and around the world throughout much of the 20th century. Of course, it's a continuation of the earlier beautiful piece of architecture he made even before joining the Bauhaus. And then one of his disciples built the sort of master's house for him, next to it. But you can see this incredibly reductive geometrical style. That's the thing that the Bauhaus introduces into architecture. And in the interior, because by now enough people had worked with the Bauhaus and sort of got into the style, they realised that he worked with a guy called Marcel Breuer, who's one of the great furniture designers of the 20th century, and Breuer did the interior of this facility in Dessau. It was, again, a bit of a failure. Gropius leaves in, I think, 29. He's replaced by someone, we'll talk about that in a second. But the building itself is a kind of monument now. It's empty. You can go and visit it, and it's one of the great objects of the 20th century for sure. And it's astonishingly influential on contemporary architecture. Think about all the skyscrapers that start to get built in New York from the 30s onwards, are totally post-Gropius, right? But one of the famous moments, particularly in our post-feminist sensibilities, quite correctly, one of the most famous teachers at this second iteration of the Bauhaus, at Dessau, is a woman called Gunter Stolzel, who made these beautiful tapestries, and she is regarded as one of the most innovative and important tapestry makers of the 20th century, and notably one of the second woman who ever taught at the Bauhaus. And she's become, an absolutely iconic tapestry maker. And again, it's showing the range of things that could all coexist, at the Bauhaus. The contemporary art school is absolutely Bauhaus. They teach an incredibly wide variety of media at Monash, where I teach, or the VCA, or the RMIT. They teach fashion and art. That is the revolution in art schools that the Bauhaus started. I think in about 1928, from memory, Hannes Meyer takes over from Gropius. He proved to be very unpopular, and many of the lecturers left. He only lasted about a year or two, and then Mies van der Rohe, another very famous architect, a very post-Gropius architect, took over, and he ran the school until, as I say, it was closed by the Nazis in 1933, soon after taking power, of course seeing it as a threat to everything that Nazism represented. And so that's the kind of end, in some ways, of the Bauhaus. Gropius, as you know, for example, will then go to Harvard and teach. He's sort of driven out, of course, by the beginning, before the Second World War, and builds, one of the great buildings of the 20th century, which I urge you to go and see. It's in Cambridge, where Harvard is, Cambridge, Mass. It's the Gropius House. And if you ever go there, it's just, I had the honour of seeing it 2 years ago. It's just jaw-dropping. It's the most beautiful house. The proportions are perfect. And again, it's his own private residence. My God, he was well off, but then he was a professor of architecture at Harvard back in the day. But what's really famous about the house is, again, it's transparent extraordinarily. You can see into the kitchen, very importantly, so you can see what people are actually doing in the house. The whole idea of privacy and the sort of bourgeois cutting yourself off from the world is not the Bauhaus idea. It is a kind of revolution. One of the things that now recently the Bauhaus has been picked up for is, its teaching of children's art. It had a program of teaching children, because again, if art is not this haughty, aristocratic, inspired exercise, but a kind of technique, children should learn as well. So they actually did have a long program of teaching art. And very famously, one of the women, probably at the time women were given that task largely, is a woman called Friedel Dicker Brandeis, who's in fact a Jewish woman. And she's become also a very iconic figure of the 20th century. Why, in a way? When the Nazis took power, some of you probably know, they set up these kind of fake Jewish ghettos as sort of like the public facade that they weren't doing anything bad to Jewish people. And they were these kind of show towns. It was, of course, a precursor to them being taken to concentration camps, and they were confined to these ghettos of exclusively Jewish people. And she taught kids to keep their morale up during that probably very difficult period. And then later she went, she was sent to the concentration camp of Terezin, where she was, of course, killed eventually, and she was there for about 2 years. And even very, very famously then, she taught children's art to the children in the concentration camp, and has become a kind of heroine, you might say, of the sort of, redemptive power of art in the worst of worst possible circumstances. And apparently it did keep these kids' morale up in the concentration camps. It's quite something. And again, it's a testament to the sort of utopian hope held out for art, even in the most ghastly of circumstances. So she's become an incredibly famous hero of the Bauhaus. And, without going into all the details, in the last 20 or 30 years, and the centenary, of course, was in 2019, a lot of recent scholarship on the Bauhaus, there's some nice books on them in readings, is to rediscover particularly the women who taught at the Bauhaus, who have been written out of the story for many, many years. And people are now doing that, which is quite an interesting new thing. Interesting, if we tell the story, in 1920, soon after the Bauhaus started, I think a rather arrogant guy, a Dutch guy called Theo van Doesburg, who'd started up the Stijl in Amsterdam in 1917, again a kind of abstract art movement, came to Dessau and started to criticise the Bauhaus for teaching things badly. He thought it could do it better. And he asked Gropius for a job, and Gropius told him to get lost. And then he started up a competition art school next to them, and teaching many of the same things. Van Doesburg, again, even more than Gropius, was really much a people person who brought a whole group of Dutch artists together, like Pierre Mondran, Gerrit Rietveld, etc. But these are some of his works, and again, this is one of the influences that Dick Bruna, as a Dutchman, of course, really could not have possibly avoided. So these are some of and the Stijl was in fact a very famous manifesto-like magazine that Van Doesburg published from 1917 onwards, and here are some of the very famous abstract covers. And you see this emphasis on the straight line that's one of the real characteristics of what we call neoplasticism, which is the Dutch abstract art movement, which is where undoubtedly Dick Bruna gets his line although very interestingly, it's curved. But fascinatingly, if anyone has time and you watch the video of him doing his curved lines, he does them in a very ungraphic way. He sort of presses them on a paper. So it's not at all a gesture that he makes those lines out of. They're very mechanically reproduced and sort of abstract even so. That's why it's so peculiar that he likes Matisse, who's the absolute opposite. He has this gorgeous hand, his arabesque of the throw of the gesture. His lines are absolutely not like that. They are, although they're curved, very neoplasticist lines in my humble opinion. But here are some of the famous covers of neoplasticism. There's a very famous exhibition in 1920. Now, let's just touch on a couple of the great, Dutch Stijl artists. Gerrit Rietveld is one of the great, again, furniture designers. And he's also an architect. And just a couple of other but this is quite interesting. One of the things about neoplasticism, and it was quite inspired by Kandinsky, is they felt that their abstractions were abstractions of things down in the world. In the same way that Kandinsky felt that his weird sets of colours actually correspond to real emotions down on Earth, one of the things that neoplasticism claims is that its abstract forms are actually higher versions of worldly objects. We'll talk about it in a moment. Pierre Mondran was a theosophist. Now, theosophy is a kind of notionally rational religion, right? So you look at all the world's religions and you compare them, you go, what are they really about? They're about some higher spiritual state that hovers over this world that can explain this world, right? And so there's always this thing in this Stijl art, you take these forms of the world and abstract them. And you see a couple of nice examples. Here's one of their artists called Bart van der Lek. It was this weird exercise where you progressively abstract a cow. It looks ridiculous, but there it is. And here's Theo van Dersberg, his successive abstractions of a cow. And sort of, in fact, and this also happens with the Russian constructivists, Mondrian, very much like Kandinsky, because he's a spiritual artist, feels that his sets of colours, you can read them back. They're actually abstractions of things. Now that seems crazy, no one does that anymore, but he really felt he was doing that. And he's coming out of this lineage too. And of course, that kind of incredible abstraction of Miffy is on the borderline between figuration and abstraction in the same way, right? Like, Miffy's like an abstraction of a little rabbit or something like that, right? And just maybe to finish a bit, von Dersberg, this is where he really does get influenced by constructivism. We might turn to Pierre Mondran, who's really one of my favourite and I think most poignant artists. Led a really difficult life. He was a Dutchman. He went to France. Lots of European artists, of course, did, to pick up on what was going on over there. He was driven back by the First World War and had to come back to Holland, where he ran into von Dersberg. Pierre Mondran was a very reclusive, diffident man. He had a very strong theosophical belief. Probably not too earnest. He's one of the world famous virgins, for example. He just couldn't sleep with anyone because that wasn't part of his religion. So he goes back to Paris. He stays there for about, I think, 38, and he gets driven out again by the Second World War and heads to America. And here's, I think, where the really poignant story starts. Already then he's thoroughly recognised, not sufficiently, but he's undoubtedly one of the world's great, or 20th century's greatest artists. He's driven out of France, has to flee to America ahead of the Nazis. He arrives in America with 2 suitcases. His worldly possession has to leave much of his studio behind him. You're heartbreaking, what the hell's going to happen? He actually survives the war amazingly. In one of the suitcases are his favourite paints and paintbrushes, and in his other suitcase is his favourite ball gown or tuxedo where he loves dancing. Mondrian, as I'll show you probably know this great work by Mondrian, I'll show it to you, Broadway, Boogie, Woogie, was totally into black American jazz, which was quite a big thing in Europe, which is absolutely against his, cerebral religious sensibility, his little weird compulsion or something was black jazz, and this is incredibly touching photo, I just can't find it. Mondrian also was absurdly tall for the time, he's like 6'7", like incredibly tall, gaunt, intellectual looking guy, doesn't look like the kind of guy that loved jazz dancing. There's a really touching photo of him in America where he finally gets to hear jazz, of him twirling around this much, much shorter woman on the dance floor with the tails of his tux passing out. It's the strangest juxtaposition with his little Tanzania's glasses, like the most brilliant of artists is getting it off. It's a fantastic photo. Anyway, and it's really touching. Now, just to show you a couple of my favourite Mondrians, one of the things, this is a great story too, which we won't deal with, one of the things I'm a little bit interested in at the moment, we always think of the gum tree as this particularly Australian tree that makes Australian art Australian, like the Heidelberg School. You go to the big show at the NGV at the moment. We always think that we own the gum tree. Actually, the gum tree was taken to France by Nicolas Bauguin to plant in Napoleon's wife's Josephine's garden in Malmaison on the Seine River, and then spread around the south of France. And painters loved painting the gum tree. And here at Pierre Mondrian's successive versions of a series of gum trees, which is amazing. And actually you could say that Mondrian comes to abstraction, like moves from cubism to what will be called his form of neoclassicism through his successive studies of the gum tree. Actually lots of great European artists did gum trees. That'd be a wonderful show, I think. Not Australia's gum trees, the world's gum trees. They're possibly more interesting. Here's Mondrian's other, I think, great series. When he goes back to Holland, he's very struck, of course, by the flatness of the dikes and the non-rippling sea of Holland's, of course, on the water. And he paints these beautiful versions of the moonlight cast on the water seen from the pier, which is here. Now, why am I saying this of these? That beautiful animation of the ripple, right, which sort of crosses the sort of rigid geometries of the squares, is a kind of form of animation, I think. And it's kind of, I think, interesting to think about, you know, there are cartoon versions of Miffy, and of course, you know, they are kind of cartoons. And I think there's something really interesting here that I'm sure Dick Bruna looked at and thought, well, this very rigid geometrical form can be kind of animated. And that's what happens, I think, with the difference between the various curves and straight lines in some of these works. There are these sort of rhythms to the pictures that sort of cross them. And I think a very intelligent, you know, visual scrutinizer like Dick Bruna would have looked at those and go, I get that. You need a bit of energy crossing the rigid lines. And this is, of course, you know, famous final Mondrian. But here is, and that's the great Broadway Boogie Woogie that he painted when he was in New York. And of course, as a Dutchman living in an incredibly flat country, he was totally struck by the skyscrapers of New York. And that's a great high view of the grid-like structure of New York, probably with the taxis in a beautiful abstract way caught in the traffic. And of course, it's very notable, Barack Obama, full well-known inspiration of American jazz, I think, on Mondrian, is a great American Dutch painter, put one of his paintings in the White House, which is kind of very nice. Of course, Mondrian takes over the world, right, with the Yves Saint Laurent dress. But here's another really nice story, I think, just a side story. Mondrian is very famous, or was very famous for his use of the double black line. And more recently, again, talking about like new versions of feminist art history or putting women back into art history, people ask some very interesting questions. Where did those black lines come from? The story of these art movements is actually very interesting because, in fact, one of the members of the Stijl, which is quite a wide circle of, you know, Dutch artists, I didn't mention them all, was in fact an English woman called Marlo Moss. And there are some of her paintings. Now, all of the Stijl artists, one of the paradoxes of Mondrian, this very reductive style, is lots of artists at the time are painting just like Mondrian, right? Like Van Leeuwen. It's very interesting why Mondrian becomes the one. That's one of the odd things about art history. We always pick out like heroes. But it actually comes to this big discussion about shapes. And Marlo Moss was one of the people in this circle. Of course, as an English woman she was probably on the margins of this, and the men probably disregarded it. But many people now say that it's Marlo Moss who first came up with the black line. There's a very nice book by a contemporary curator called Lucy Howarth, replanting Marlo Moss's work. But that's not the end of the story of Marlo Moss. When I show Marlo Moss to my hipster young students in first year art history, they're absolutely taken by her. She's a fantastic style icon. She's a lesbian woman who formed a relationship with a Dutch woman who was married with a child, and they lived together with the little child, and there they are on the right. But she used to wear this incredibly shaved hair and jockey's pants, like an absolute style hipster. That's the coolest thing. All my students go, that's the hippest person in Melbourne today. But that's even not the end of the story. One of the sad things about Marlo Moss is she was Jewish. And so when the Second World War started, she had to leave Europe and go back to England to safety. In fact, with her Dutch wife, you might say, and their little child, who's now the executor of the estate. And her studio was bombed unlike Mondrian, since she lost all of her work. The only record of much of her work, which sort of proves her intimate relation with the Stijl artists, that she was one of them doing the work at the same time, etc., etc., she would remade them in the 50s back in England, was one catalogue, black and white catalogue of the show she had. And what's really interesting is there's a contemporary woman Dutch artist called Florette Dijkstra, whose project is to remake Marlo Moss's work based on this lost catalogue and putting the colours back in Marlo Moss's paintings. And that's the catalogue. So that's a lovely little exercise, I suppose, of historical reclamation. Now that might be, I think, the end of my little story about maybe some of the sources of Dick Bruna. The connections are sort of there, but there to be thought about as well. And the last, most puzzling one for mine is it's nice, that's a children's playground, just shows you the incredible influence of the Stijl on everything around us still today. That's my local children's playground. I took that photo when I was walking around a couple of days ago. Oh my God, look at that. That's the Stijl right there. He's interested in Matisse, God forbid, because Bruna is the most ungestural, unvirtuosic artist you could possibly imagine. Incredibly mechanical, cuts out things. This is the guy is the complete opposite, a sort of gestural virtuoso, this famous arabesque hand. I think Bruna's probably looking at him in wonderment and aspiration as much as anything else. But of course, one of the great colourists of the 20th century, and one of the famous things about Matisse's colour, which maybe is a little bit about Dick Bruna, is famously Matisse wanted to get rid of the foreground, background distinctions in his work. He wanted your eye to move around the picture and be unable to settle. Remember Matisse's famous statement about his paintings. He said he wanted them to be like an armchair for a tired businessman, which I think means to sort of slowly vibrate your eye, like rub you over or something. In other words, you sort of slowly get moved around the picture. And he always starts off his paintings with this fantastic yellow and black opposition, like it's like starting the key of a car. And then you move to the next colour. You go through the reds, the blues, go through the yellows, and your eye just wanders around the picture like that. And it can never stop because it's always drawn to the colour next to it, like its complementaries and things. And I think you see that equally here. It's very typical of his style, like brilliant. It is this pattern of all yellow and red, yellow and black. Then you go through the reds and blues, just like the other one, the Painter's Family. Up here, you always go, oh, that's a match. Think of Dick Bruna around. Yep, that's a match. That's a match. Yep. And your eye keeps on being drawn around the canvas like that. It doesn't sort of stop. And in a way, of course, what it does beautifully is fuse the things at the front and the things at the back. They're all just on the level of your eye. And he often has these beautiful insects, like the window is just like another pattern. And that's exactly what you'll see in some of these Dick Brunas. So there are great things that some of the major 20th century artists have bequeathed to everybody. And I think very observant and ultimately in a way humble artists like Dick Bruna get that and make it their own and do very nice things with it. So Dick Bruna's taken these great art lessons and I think in some ways made them accessible to children in some ways. That's why they're so attractive, but they're actually attractive to all of us. I think ultimately he's taken the lesson, the great lesson to be taken from the Bauhaus, that there is no such thing as high and low art, or adult art, or children's art, or pretentious art, and non-pretentious art. It's just art. And so I think, he makes no excuses, I think, for his work. He puts these highly abstract things in children's books, which works, and he's proved that fact. So there you are, everyone. I hope that was okay. I think that's my last slide. Well, that's my last slide. Yeah. It's a bit like cutting out these things, maybe. He just doesn't have the beautiful grace. But there's something like, it's really touching when he's cutting those things out. He makes that little tent over there in the video. Yeah, the little tent there. Yeah, you're looking at it. That's the one he makes in the video. It's really touching the way he cuts it out. Not daring himself to actually do a gesture, then he presses it, and then he knows what he's drawing before he does it. That's really sweet. And I think he probably looked at someone like Matisse and go, God, I wish I could do that, but I can't. I'll do what I can do, which is great. So anyway, there it is.